This is Dave Monk, the Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board.
And it's been a busy July 4th. And end up with fireworks there that both of us watched from the village of Savoy, or south on South First Street. A really good show. And I don't know whether the wind was blowing the wrong direction, but it seemed to be much more muted than normal. The poor dog population has a real problem with it when it's loud. But very aesthetic, I thought, and friendly. Well, we got a lot of things today. I was running around a pre-parade, post-parade, planning. Lord knows, I met up with so many people yesterday that I'd like to report some of it to you. That's part of the mission of this program, is to report on environmental things, which often brings me into contact with a lot of different people, some of whom I can't always remember the name of, but wow, it's impressive that you have to realize that people really are into environmental things and passing things on to another generation and teaching in the process. And it often involves young children as well as older people. And I just enjoyed it yesterday. We did a parade. I'm very glad what I did. I've done it for so many years that people kind of expect that we'll be there. It was a very different parade because I didn't walk, and I usually do walk. I had to drive my vehicle. We put a picture of roadside prairie on one vehicle, and then Tom Pantham lent me another vehicle, and Liz Kirby drove that. And that had echinacea on the roadside, and the statement was, roadside prairies need no more policies. And it was different in a way because the people who read it had to think about it, and by the time they were thinking about it, you were out of distance of getting a reaction. This wasn't a see as you go. It was not for everyone. Even the word policies is a little hard for an event like a parade. You try to be very simplistic, but there's no way about it. We have tremendously excess mowing, and part of it is cultural. And part of it is jobs, and part of it is a loss of natural species and pollinators, and just the ambiance of driving a road that is mown for hundreds of miles is not awfully exciting. And so we were trying to change a thought, and so it wasn't a bouncing float like in front of us. We had a jester and people dressed up, and that was interesting. We were the last of the parade, and part of the reason for that was that I sent an email, and there were two emails on the docket, and one had a dot behind .com, and I thought that wasn't right, but and I forgot to look, but some days later I saw that it had bounced. So we were last in the parade, and that was interesting too, because by the time you get to the last element, you can see the end, and so by the time we went past, in some cases, people are already up and leaving. It's like going to the pictures and not looking at the titles on the roll at the end. You all of a sudden have people in front of you that are standing up ready to go before the real end has come. Yeah. But that was a fine, fine day. It was a beautiful day, and people were pleased, and I thought that was very positive. People came past our booth. Scott Dorset was being delivered to the parade by Meg, and she came by. Dan came by. He's from Savoy, and he works with a vet school, but he's prominently known for working with contra dancing. And then Patsy Petrie was there, politicking as usual, but that's okay. And I had a lot of questions for her, especially about school location. And we may talk a little later about thinking about Judeo-Christian school. I had talked to her some about the possible location of a high school near to Parkland College, where behind a little north of or a little west of the Mattis Avenue post office, there's a distribution center that's not being totally used, and we wondered if that could be converted to a high school or even replaced by a high school. But still a little on the west side of town, so if you're on the east side of town, then you're going to almost have to have a bus. You can't walk or bicycle. So Patsy's feeling is that it should be infill, where Judeo-Christian has moved out of the old school that was on Prospect Avenue. That would be close to the new school that's on State or Randolph, and a little closer to the core of the community. So we talked about that some. I went past people who have known us for years, a family of young folk that are I've known for a long time. They've come and helped Nicole and Saul and Jose and Amanda and Marissa and Max, and they were all standing there. I managed to take a photograph of them, so we'll probably drop a photograph in. Then there was Bill Saylor riding along on his bicycle, taking a record of the parade, and he'd worked with me as co-host on this program for many, many years. Rich Cahill was there, and there were other people who said positively that, well, we didn't know whether you were coming or not. So there's some expectation. So sometimes I'm an earthman, and sometimes I'm a prairie monk, and sometimes... So I was dressed in my parade garb as sort of the prairie monk, but I was driving, so you didn't really see that, but I wandered around with it beforehand. So I missed saying hi to a lot of people on the parade as a walking person. But I can't walk quite as fast as Corvettes can move. It just, by the time you go back and forth across the parade and talk to people a little bit, you have to run to catch up. So it's different, but afterwards, we didn't stop yesterday, but afterwards, I usually politic with people and talk to them about their floats. We get to see floats that we didn't see before. And so Scott Dorset was probably doing something about the coal mining in the east side of Champaign County and west side of Vermilion County. So I poke around a little bit, but it wasn't appropriate, and there weren't too many people stopped that you could chat with. But, so it was interesting to start with to create a float, or you wonder whether it's worth it. You have to have an idea. How can you do it? The picture itself that we used was costly, and just the impression alone, plus some banner to go with it, was in the vicinity of $400. And you have to wonder if that expense is justified. We have 2 banners now. We use them in other places, but basically I felt that just a week or so ago that I had directed the Department of Transportation attention to the fact that our railroad right-of-way on Route 10 gets overmown to amount of acres of ground, not on Department of Transportation territory. And so they had gone out and put signs in a lot of places where we have begged for no more policies. But then we had taken photographs of what happened as a result, and I think we dealt with this in other programs, but it's perpetual. The 15-foot mower, when you have a road like Route 10 that has been widened several times, the edict is to mow down to the ditch, and the ditch gets to be fairly close to the road. It's only about 5 feet. So with a 15-foot mower, you then roll over into the upside, which doesn't have to be mown at this time of the year, and then into the adjacent territory. So we recorded that, and we hope that public policy towards mowing may change. It's a very, very expensive luxury. Often it is violating territory. Often it is recreational. People who do enjoy mowing. It's neat and tidy, and there's a certain power about going into a bunch of cordgrass and working your way through it at a quarter of a mile an hour, and with a huge piece of equipment that costs in the first place. So from point of view of labor and destruction of pollinators and plants and the cost of the equipment and the energy, it all would read that in a time of when things are fairly austere at the state level, this is an awful expense, and it's just not aesthetic. So that's what we were talking about. But once you do think that that might be the thing, you have to get the right statement. Do you have a storyline on that people can't read because it's too long? It takes best part of half a week to figure out what to do. Then you have to get a picture that's appropriate and have it printed. And Graphic Press did that for me and called me just before they closed on Thursday night. So I had the sign, we had to put it up. And then that's interesting because we do it on Market Street, and there's a whole bunch of people come by and say, yay, yay, and agree with what our statement is. And then I got a chance to give them a quick trip through the pocket prairie, and that's kind of amazing for some people. Other people like to lounge there, and that is a little disappointing to us because it sort of blocks the passageway. So I have to talk very gently to people who like to loiter, and we have that sort of dynamic on Market Street. Okay, so we get the vehicle going, and we move to the area where is assembly area. So I've mentioned some of the people there that came by. Stuart Levy came by, and it was interesting that we were all photographing each other at the same time, so we're photographing the photographers. And I talked to Patsy Petrie not only about the school location, but about salvage, because I'd been to a city meeting and suggested it was time we have return to commercial recycling. And she was also big on composting. If you're in a town like San Francisco, you're almost forced to recycle scraps of food and things like that. And we have a long way to go here. If we're going to attract Silicon Valley people, we're going to have to think about behaving a little differently with compost. I'm looking at my notes here. Oh, I think dismantling was something that was the same thing. You got to talk to people. And you perhaps it doesn't hurt to leave your vehicle around for a while so people can get the idea. There's a lot of traffic and New Year's Eve, well, not New Year's Eve, on July 4th Eve. People are there and enjoying. So I had someone asked me what I was doing. I was putting little weights on the bottom of the grommets of the, I was using glass beads. And so that was intriguing. But she said that someone in Kansas knew me because they had belonged to the Urbana Free Library. And so we exchanged thoughts about that, and then she asked if she could bring her boys along because her husband was a guest at Mike and Molly's. And so yes, so she waited till she could get husband and the boys. We did a little field trip. And these are people who have been in Champaign. And we shared a lot. They got their undergraduate degree here in art, and then sort of toured the world for about 10 years, and then came back and got computer science degrees. And so now they're teaching that sort of thing at Illinois State University, which is not too far away. So they come across to Champaign every so often. And their two boys are very active and enjoyed that little tour. And their mentors, Kevin Hamilton, I got it right. I don't think I got it right. But Kevin, their mentor, was there, and we talked, and I have a Sikh associate where he has been an engineer for years here, and he had a retreat. Probably many university people have properties over on the Salt Fork or Jordan Creek, that sort of area in Vermilion County. And he had a plot there, and he sold me a tractor. And so it was interesting to meet with him. Just friendly things going on. And we will be in contact. We exchange addresses and things like that. The morning after was, I guess it was on the morning of the parade, after the parade was finished. It was the afternoon. There was a wedding group that came to Market Street. And it's sort of amazing the number of wedding groups that come to take photographs in front of the old buildings just north of Weft, and sometimes in our pocket prairie, and sometimes in Mike and Molly's, because the walls are covered with ivy and it looks nice. So it just reminds us that streets can have personalities and they can be appreciated. Then I cleaned up a few things, and then I thought it's a nice day to look at the co-op. Now the co-op is the co-op from Urbana, which has bought a building on North Walnut, just opposite PACA, the Preservation and Conservation Association. And it will be a couple of years before they get into action, perhaps only a year. But my thought is that these sorts of situations need some long-term planning. There are railroads associated with this. There's a movement of to put up 9-story buildings and the like on the corner of Main and Neal. There's a Black Dog Saloon, which is just north of the 1923 railroad station. There are businesses in that station. There's the MTD building. So I took my camera and started to walk around. I've done this before, and I've talked about it some before, but not in context of the co-op. So I'm sort of dedicating this discussion to Maya, and she mightn't expect that, but she's an employee at the Common Ground Market, and I keep asking her what she's going to do with. She's an artist, and what's she going to do with art here? So I sort of took a field trip to explain what I thought. Some of the buildings that are there are angled so that you can bring they're warehouses that you can bring a train into. The News Gazette used to bring all its paper in that way. So some of this rail bed has been dismantled, but some of it is still there. You could, with a little reconstruction, you could make a railroad which would allow historic trains to come in from Monticello Railroad Museum without having to violate the dignity of a Canadian national main line. So I'm looking at where the old railroad sheds are, where the railroad lines are. I'm thinking that wouldn't it be wonderful to have a couple of rail cars that were designed to talk about food and food grown locally, and there's something about the growth of vegetables, and so I'm thinking also about a plot of land. There's a little bit to the north of the co-op. Could that be turned back to what it was 50 years ago when the black community had vegetable gardens there? Could that be reinstated? So business is moving north. Jeff Mylander has taken over the old Illinois power plant and has remodeled that. And there's an attempt to improve the cloverleaf at Neal Street. It's a little bit of a problem that you get to Washington Street and into downtown, and it's sort of a bottleneck. So what do you do? Do you encourage traffic to come up and through the town? I think the mindset is that if you send your traffic around by Lincoln Avenue or other places to get into town, you lose that business. But I've been to many towns, and one of them in Iowa I can think of was, it might have been Nebraska. It was Nebraska. That the city fathers had decided not to have a ring corridor around town, and they put it right through downtown. And I was photographing sand trucks and business trucks that were going right through this narrow downtown, and it was explained to me that was an attempt to get business to come to this town. It used to be a town that was occupied by the captains of people on the river, and so it has this dignity, and yet you can't force traffic that is through traffic to stop at a historic town. I think your historic town has to remain a historic town. So that has connotations for Champaign. A few years ago, this was a dead central business district, and everyone migrated to the mall. And now it's gotten gentrified. That term means that instead of having empty buildings, you have buildings that have upstairs apartments that are fancy apartments, and they bring business. And there's a problem with parking, and how do you do arts? You've just had a blues and barbecue event that is in a parking lot in the center of what I'm talking about. So I kept wandering around and figuring out what should we do. Canadian National is not too excited about having short lines that provide an opportunity for trains that are have a mixture of wagons on them. It's called a manifest train. They don't want to pick up 2 or 3 cars here. They'd like to pick up 100 cars of grain. And we've been thinking about this, and we've been thinking about 3 miles of abandoned railroad between Bonneville and Seymour, which hasn't been abandoned yet, but there's been a drive to keep that line afloat, and we've been part of that, and that we are just hoping that the 2 elevators can buy the line and still be able to provide Canadian National with a number of, say, 50 or 100 cars of grain at a time. Not easy, because that's a lot of grain. But Canadian National also services Kraft Humco, and we have a different sort of train technology. We have intermodal trains. And those intermodal trains often have the wheels between the cars, not under the cars. So these trains do not come apart, and they're loaded with gantry cranes, and they're loaded with shipping containers. And you see them going through, they're going through very fast. And so when we think of developing our railroads or preserving our railroads, can there be places where you can, these intermodal trains can to be taken apart at about every 7 units. You can have a small unit if you want. And the advantage of crates is that you can put computers in them and you don't have to constantly hump the train and bump it. You can take a different product. So if we're thinking about the north end of Champaign and the railroads there, can we think of some businesses that might put a crate on a intermodal train? So where would you put your yard with a crane? Should it be somewhere up north of Champaign? We've had a class that's been looking at the boneyard. So you have a boneyard. Sometimes it can be aesthetic. Sometimes it can be a detention pond. But the railroads go right by these places. So how, if you're a landscape architecture student, how do you look at something like a junkyard that's adjacent to a railroad, that's adjacent to an old ice factory, which has now been pulled down, and that will be a detention pond, I think. So I'm wandering around, looking and thinking and dreaming, and I'm looking at Rogers, a big warehouse, and I knew that lines used to go in there because I one time drove a car over the line and got stuck on the rails. And so there I found out that the rails went actually into the building, and some of the rails are still there. And this is just 500 feet from the co-op. So could you have an interesting relationship. Could you get vegetables in by train? Probably not, because that's not so convenient. And but there is a history there. So we've got word from the Surface Transportation that the Bonneville elevator and the Seymour elevator, I'm bouncing around here, but they're the ones that might bring a historic train in. Where would you put it, and how could it have some straightaway? Because if you have an old train coupled together, it doesn't couple together as easily if you're on a bend. It needs a little bit of straightaway. So I'm asking people to think 50 years, 100 years, perhaps 200 years about how we work with a group like Canadian National to allow small units of product to be put on a main line. It's not as financially successful, but it reads a lot of sense. But somebody has to think about this. So I walk over to the junction box where Norfolk Southern comes in from Bloomington. And this is a road that's a little bit controversial because the 25 miles from Urbana to Danville is possibly a return to rail if we're thinking about re-railing in the future. And that's what the rail banking is about. You lend it to the bicycle people until you need it. And often bicycle people aren't too keen to lose their tracks, but there is a sensitivity there. You see that the Norfolk Southern has to go across a main line that's very busy. You can see that the steel is bright and shiny on the Canadian side. The line that goes through to Urbana is a little bit on the rusty side, and it stops at Urbana at the moment. So how can we plan to get a train to Urbana as well as to Champaign? How could we think about the high school, and how can we think about having a small interurban that would go from the Urbana to Champaign, to a high school at Judah Christian, or a high school out near Parkland College? How can we think about the moraine and how we use the moraine as our only little rise that gives us interest before we put a whole bunch of strip malls on it? So some people who are in the age bracket of being here for another 50 or 100 years, how can we encourage those people to think about planning for the future? So I'm wanting to do a sort of a blog or something here. I took enough photographs that I could point out what I'm talking about. And that's... people have to do a little bit about energy of knowing what a railroad does and what are its advantages. You have to almost know what a spike is and how the ties go together and how this train can take a bend and go around from Norfolk Southern onto the Canadian National, and you could go somewhere else with a product. Where would you park the product? What warehouse would you have? It's very interesting. And okay, let's leave that one. I came back downtown, took some photographs of the Parisian situation which we've created in Champaign, where the sidewalks were widened and you can put tables out and there's people everywhere. And friends, and sat down and talked about Sidoris, and so I talked to Liz, and this person were talking. And at some stage, years ago, I must have recommended or been asked to talk about Prairie on a farm near to Sodorus. So we talk about Sodorus. And Sodorus is a small town. And just before you get into Sodorus from 57, there was an old barn, and it had all sorts of old reaping equipment in it. And outside, the gentleman had the Sodorus jail. And the Sodorus jail was absolutely wonderful. It was big enough to contain 2 drunks for a night. It was like much less than about 12 by 12, and the boards were flat, and there were bars on the windows, and a couple of planks for sitting. And this was the Sodorus jail, and I think it's disappeared, but it was kind of wonderful. No, so we talk about Sodorus and the little villages that were on a pony trail in its day, and these are the sort of things that people are obviously very interested in. Sometimes I haven't had the time to take an interest in, but it's there. So I'm going to go now to a longer range planning situation. I was up at the Pope Prairie, which is north of Rantoul, and taking some photographs of flowers that I don't see unless you catch them at the right time. So then I had some other concerns. The Pope Prairie is on the Bloomington Moraine, and it's in about the middle of the moisture gradient, and as you go up the hill, there's an area where the farmer mows adjacent to his fence line. Now, this is not your 100-foot wide road. This is a 200-foot wide area, because they were going to widen the road to a 2-way road, and I suspect that they'll still do that in the future. But right now, it's loaded with prairie. It doesn't have all the species, but it has a range, and you have dry areas created by loess, which is when the glaciers retreated 10,000 years ago, the riverways dried up, and the winds blew sand dunes across near the rivers. The heavier material fell out first, and then you got loess blowing across the state. Sometimes it's very deep, and sometimes it's only 6 inches high. But it's on the top of that moraine, and if it's very wet, it's like slop, slop, slop. If it's very dry, you have to imagine you can't break it with a hammer. But plants survive in that, and they're different from what's on the slope, which is a higher moisture gradient. And even further down the slope on the south side of the cemetery is a swampland. And that's very typical of a glacier dribbling out its water and making a flat land like Flatville. And then people come along and drain it, and it's very good soil. But the prairie is different in those 3 locations. So I was taking photographs of this because I think it's an area that should be protected by the Department of Transportation. Somebody came along in a pickup truck, and it turned out to be a previous manager of the city or the village of Rantoul. Problem, and he said, "Well, yes, he has horses." So and talked to him. He gets the hay from when that mowing is done. He sometimes gets the hay. So we walked up this corridor and looked at where the river or the palmate drains off the hill. That's why you could run livestock on this area, because it's not very good for flatland row crops. So the land is a little cheaper for that sort of thing. Then Ken said to me, "You're Dave Monk, aren't you?" And so Ken Moglen was aware of who I was, and we spent quite some time. And I said, one of the things I'd like to do is to plan for a road trip where people would get off 57 at Kankakee. They would go perhaps 3 miles adjacent to the railroad and realize what a prairie is adjacent to a railroad line, and then come into Shabance and take old Route 45 south, and at various stages take off to the left or the right to see interesting things. It depends on whether you're going from A to B on 57 and you have to get there in time. But there are people who do enjoy meandering and looking around. So I put together a proposal for, I've thought it could be a national park tour, and you could include the farmers that are using it. For instance, the farmers that are on the moraine realize that they're on gravel, and they can, glacial till is very fertile, but the water runs off it, so they do deep irrigation. And so there's a different way of farming. If you came to Ludlow, you could take a corridor to the east and go to the Vermilion River, where there are the wet areas of the prairie, where there are even ducks and geese and wetland species. You could, a little further near to Kankakee, you could go to La Rabe and realize that some of the Canadians that were French came to La Rabe, and it has a character. It's on the Iroquois River, and there was the mafioso and others that would take contraband liquor up the river. And so there are stories, and there's an Iroquois conservation district which shows you what a dry prairie is like, with sand dunes that were probably in the vicinity of the Iroquois River and that drainage basin. So come south, you get to a little prairie at Rantoul, and people could enjoy that. And then we would like to establish or reestablish NOMO outside the Air Force Base. That's how Ken had come in contact with me. I was kind of known for wanting NOMO policies on the roadside, and I'd achieved them through some of these people. And I reminded Ken that I'd gone to Mayor Manjilton, and Mayor Manjilton's comment was, I can't handle you like with a 10-foot pole, but what do you want? That meant that Mayor Manjilton understood what I was talking about. That politically, people like to see the roadsides mown. So we got a no-mow policy on that corridor north of Rantoul and around the Air Force Base. It changed with different administrations, so we lost it. And at one stage, Mrs. Bogorovich was working with Reconstruction Prairies, and they decided to put a Reconstruction Prairie north of Rantoul. And so help me, they dug up a good prairie in order to put in a rinky-dink prairie, and then 2 years later, it got mown out, because nobody has the patience to wait 10 years for a good prairie to grow, or let the old prairie grow through the new prairie. So yes, we had some conversation. But I want to say that I'm sad that in many cases, if we don't say these things, we are, it's not good. If you have ideas, you should present them. In the case of Champaign, I'm sad that we've lost some railroad connections that could have been there perhaps if we'd been able to present our case. Not always possible, but I think that the idea of a national park drive-through, you could drive through almost straight through Champaign. You could go east to the Meadowbrook Park. You could come back on Windsor Road, go past 45. You could even go south to Effingham and there's a Ken Mundy Prairie, which is federally sponsored and a railroad right-of-way prairie that is very rich. And if you're coming from the south, I would say that that would be the starting point for this little tour. But you should say it, and otherwise people don't know that you're dreaming. And so I've tended to do some of this over the years, and you don't necessarily win. But every once in a while, something nice happens, and it mightn't happen in your era, but it is there and possible. Yes, I'm just looking at my notes here.
This might be a good moment to jump in and mention to folks who may have just tuned in. This is the Prairie Monk. This is July the 5th, 2015, the day after the 4th of July, Independence Day. And Dave is giving people an overview of a whole bunch of things that have come up, some of which you've heard from him before, talking about, for example, the 3 miles of rail bed between Bonneville and Seymour, and some new things. I had not heard that Mrs. Blagojevich was involved with rinky-dink prairies. I've got a copy of the notes that Dave put together to help him get to the show. You mentioned something about King George V hunting. Oh. Was he in America? Was he in Illinois?
Yes, he would come to the Iroquois County area for hunting. So
again, King George, this is a guy from England, you're saying?
Yes.
Came over to America and was in central Illinois.
Yes, I think it might have been before he was king, but it was Victorian era. But yes, that's why it's a conservation district. Now, I sat with my bar friends for a while, and we chatted, and I could have stayed and just enjoyed sitting around, but I have a concern about Route 45. And one of the concerns is that it's been planted with roadside grasses and things, and we couldn't get to find out what they were planting. But they planted it with a hydroseeder, and it's there. But our prairie was decapitated in order to put in a grid improvement and huge pedestals. So every so often there's 100-foot by 100-foot construction easement, and it's coming back. So I want to know what is there and where those sites are, and eventually they will merge into each other and you won't know. So I'm very aware of the area, and the roadside, there's a lot of switchgrass on it. There's actually too much switchgrass. And there's a possibility that someone will put a cigarette butt into it and it will get on fire, and then we won't ever have a prairie because somebody will drive into the smoke, and prairie fires don't have a lot of smoke, but the roadside grasses often have a huge amount of smoke. So you can have a semi-trailer stopped in the middle of smoke, and a Datsun run under the back of it and decapitate themselves. So it's hard to burn. People want to know 3 weeks in advance when you're going to burn, and you can't do that because you don't know the weather. So I went down there with some seed that I know will compete with the switchgrass on the area adjacent to the road that's already been disturbed and replanted, and but I want to know where those 100-feet sites are so that I can watch them. So Lietris is a fairly diplomatic regrowth plant, and so I planted on the switchgrass slope down from the road. I was seeding that, and I was also pulling out sweet clover. And I didn't realize, but there were a whole slug of people sitting on the other side of the road waiting for the fireworks. And what I was doing could be done in the dark, so I was doing it in the dark, and every once in a while the car headlights would light up what I was looking at. But some of the switchgrass the clover that I was pulling out was sitting on the roadside. So if anyone's listening and they would like to help, one of the things they could do is go down and rake out the white sweet clover that I pulled out last night. But then I got to do a little extension work. I went to the gas station across the way, and I paid my 54 cents for a glass of water. It wasn't a glass; it was styrofoam, which we can't recycle. I was glad to pay the 54 cents because I had a little bit of ice, and I walked back with my can that had the seed in it and talked to people. And they were amazed. They were wondering what I was doing over there. And sometimes people think you're looking for marijuana, or you might have. I at one stage was almost arrested because it was thought by passers-by that I would break into the local bank, and so I had lots of police cars coming to a halt at and it was kind of interesting. But people don't understand what that little strip is about, and we need to look after it. So then it was time for the show, and the show was interesting. And Dave was down there too, I think. And I did take photographs. I've not tried taking photographs of fireworks before, and I was hand-holding, so if we go to television, we'll have to be careful about whether we have something that's worthwhile showing you. There was lots of smoke. When all was done, the photographs of just the smoke were interesting. Bill Saylor has already recorded. I don't know whether he did anything with the fireworks, but he has sent us a clip. So we can't put video clips into the television program. You have to understand our mechanism is a radio program, which is videotaped. We put graphics and maps, and Dave is very good at this. We'll probably put a map in today about some of this planning. And then it goes to YouTube. Now, with YouTube, you can break your program. You can go for more than an hour. The Banner Public Television is controlled by 1 hour. So we are 1 hour on the radio, so that's full. But the YouTube, you can break and put stuff in at the appropriate time, or you can put it on the end. There's another problem we have is that with the radio program, so I've mentioned perhaps 50 different things, and it's just you only can have room for one photograph or two. And my planning yesterday involved corridors, pictures of different places, and it reminded me that the Department of Planning or Landscape Architecture, those departments have a need for students to do some of this sort of work. And one of the reasons why I dedicate this to Maya, it's because she's an artist. And you need to take this site. We'll probably put a map of downtown Champaign in, but it needs a vision for the future. What might be there? And we need to think about it now. We don't need to have a complete co-op finished without some sense of how it relates to the adjacent territories and how it might relate to the future. So think about your dreams for communities and what they can do and how they can be worked. What might be interesting to people in the future, your children and your grandchildren are going to think differently about the same thing. So how do you try and get some balance there? And how do we inspire high school children to start thinking about planning? Okay, we're getting towards the end here, and we'll put in our word or two. But we thank WEF for being able to talk about these things, and we thank people for coming along and being interested and just asking questions and ending up wanting to give you a hug or two or something like that. It's rather wonderful. So I didn't add, but at night I got a call on Skype from Australia, and so I walked outside and photographed the exhibit that we put through the parade, and that went to Australia. And believe it or not, Australia is in the same boat. You have people who do more mowing than they should do. I can remember that near my parents' house there were Aboriginal markings, and if you come from England and you like hollyhocks and things like that, you take these wonderful native things and sandstone sort of interesting rocks, and you fill in over the Aboriginal markings where they would sharpen their spears and the like, and they don't even notice. So it's our responsibility to try and introduce you to some things that you mightn't have thought about, and then we want you to dream about them and come up with your own ideas. And this is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board.